I want you to picture this. 3 years. That's how long it had been since Wesley Carrington disappeared from my life without so much as a text message. 3 years since the man I thought I was going to marry packed one suitcase, left his key on my kitchen counter, and vanished while I was at work. And then, last Tuesday night at 11:47 p.m., somebody knocked on my door. I looked through the peephole and my stomach just dropped because standing on my porch, soaked from the rain, wearing a jacket I recognized because I bought it for him, was Wes. Except he didn't look like the man who broke my heart. He looked like a stranger wearing my ex-boyfriend's face. He was thinner. His eyes had this hollow, darting look like a man who hadn't slept in a real bed for a while. And behind him, at the curb, I could see everything he owned in the world sitting in 2 garbage bags. "Kayla," he said, and his voice cracked on my name. I didn't know where else to go. I stood there for a second, just looking at him through that 6-inch gap in the doorway. 3 years of silence, and here he was, dripping on my welcome mat, looking smaller than I remembered, like the years since he left had taken something out of him that no amount of charm could rebuild. Now, if you're new here, you need to understand something before I tell you what happened next, because what I did after I opened that door, it wasn't an accident. It wasn't a moment of weakness. It was the last move in a plan I'd been building for over a year. And by the end of this story, you're going to understand exactly why Wesley Carrington ended up broke, homeless, and standing in the rain in front of the one door in Columbus, Ohio he never should have knocked on. Stick around, because this gets so much worse for him before it gets better for me. Intro branding 2 to 3 minutes. Hey, welcome back. If you're new here, I tell true relationship stories, the kind where somebody thinks they got away with something until they don't. This one is a big one. I've never told it publicly before, not all of it, not with all the details. It's long, it's messy, and there's a part around the middle where I actually feel bad for a woman I never wanted to feel bad for. That's how twisted this got. Before we go further, if you're the type who likes watching a slow burn turn into a full-blown reckoning, hit subscribe now, because trust me, you do not want to miss the ending of this one. There's a moment near the end that made my own sister scream out loud when I told her, and I promise you it's coming. This gets so much worse before it gets better. Let's start from the beginning. Act 1, the relationship. 3 minutes to 15 minutes. My name's Kayla. I'm 29 years old. I work in medical device sales, and back when this story starts, I was 24, fresh off a bad breakup and convinced I was done with dating for a while. Then I met Wes. It was at a mutual friend's birthday dinner, one of those long farm-to-table places downtown with the exposed brick and the $12 cocktails. He was sitting across the table from me, and every time I said something, he actually listened, like leaned forward, made eye contact, remembered it later kind of listened. I know how that sounds now, but you have to understand, I didn't have the hindsight then that I have now. None of us do in the moment. That's the whole tragedy of these stories, isn't it? We only get to see the red flags once they're already red. He asked for my number before the night ended and texted me the next morning, not the classic 3-day wait most guys my age were playing at the time. Just a simple, I had a really good time last night. I hope that's not too forward to say. I remember showing the text to Priya, half embarrassed, half thrilled, and her saying, "Okay, that's actually kind of refreshing." Even she was charmed at first. I want you to hold on to that detail because it matters later. Priya wasn't someone who distrusted people easily. If West could get past her radar in the beginning, you can understand exactly how thoroughly he got past mine. Our first real date was at a little wine bar near the river. He asked question after question about my family, my job, what I wanted out of life in the next 5 years, and somehow made it feel like a conversation instead of an interview. Looking back, I think that's exactly what it was engineered to feel like. People like Wes don't ask questions because they're curious. They ask questions because answers are inventory. Every detail I gave him that night about my insecurities, my past relationships, what had hurt me before, became a piece of information he'd use months and years later to know exactly which buttons to press and which ones to leave alone. Wes told me he was building his own consulting business, something in supply chain optimization for mid-size manufacturing. He talked about it with this confidence that just filled the up a room. He said he'd left a toxic corporate job 8 months earlier to go out on his own and that things were about to take off. I found that kind of ambition attractive. I want to be honest about that because I think a lot of us have been there. We mistake confidence for competence. We mistake charm for character. I want to tell you about a trip we took to Michigan, up near the lake around month 10, because it's still one of my favorite memories, and I refuse to let what came later erase it entirely. We rented a tiny cabin, spent 4 days doing basically nothing, reading on the porch, cooking pasta in a kitchen with exactly one working burner, walking the shoreline at sunset. Wes seemed, in those 4 days, like the most present, most content version of himself I ever saw. No mentions of the business, no phone calls he had to step outside for, just us. I've gone back and forth in the years since on whether that trip was real or another performance. I don't actually know the answer, and I've made peace with not knowing. Maybe some small part of him did love me in whatever limited, self-serving way he was capable of loving anyone. Maybe those 4 days were simply a break between deceptions, a moment where the mask happened to slip into something that looked, from the outside, exactly like happiness. I'll never get a straight answer, and honestly, at this point in my life, I don't need one. The first 6 months were, genuinely, some of the happiest of my life. He'd show up at my apartment with soup when I was sick. He learned my coffee order down to the exact number of pumps of vanilla. He'd text me good morning every single day without fail for months. My friends called us disgustingly cute. My mom loved him, and my mom does not love easily. She'd been burned by my dad leaving when I was 12, so her radar for men was, let's say, finely tuned. And even she said, "Kayla, I think you found a good one." Here's the thing, though. Looking back, and I want to slow down here because this is the part I need you to really pay attention to. There were things happening in those first 6 months that I explained away. Little things, things that on their own meant nothing, but stacked together, they were the blueprint for everything that came after. Red flag number 1. Wes never let me see his apartment for the first 3 months. He always had a reason. His roommate was weird about visitors. He was in between leases. He was staying at a buddy's place while his unit got fumigated. I didn't push because why would I? I trusted him. Red flag number 2, his business, this consulting firm. I never once saw a client, never met one, never heard a call, never saw an invoice. When I'd ask how it was going, he'd get vague. Slow month, but big things brewing. I told myself that's just how entrepreneurship works, feast or famine. I'd seen enough LinkedIn posts to believe that. Red flag number 3, and this one I actually caught in real time and let go anyway. About 4 months in, I was helping him move a box of stuff into my apartment, just some clothes and a laptop bag, and a rolled-up bank statement fell out. I only saw it for a half second before he snatched it up, laughing it off, saying something like, "Don't look at that, it's embarrassing." I laughed too. I didn't ask again. I want to tell you about one more moment from those early months because it's small, and at the time it barely registered, but it's become one of the clearest memories I have. It was at a group dinner with some of Priya's coworkers, maybe 5 months in. Someone at the table, making normal small talk, asked Wes the completely ordinary question, "So what exactly does supply chain consulting involve day to day?" And I watched him answer for almost 2 full minutes without actually saying anything specific at all. A string of phrases like streamlining vendor relationships and identifying inefficiencies in the fulfillment pipeline that sounded impressive and meant almost nothing when you tried to picture what he actually did with his Tuesday afternoons. Nobody at that table pushed further, because why would they? It's a dinner party, not a job interview, and vague professional answers are pretty normal small talk filler for a lot of people. But I remember catching Priya's eye across the table for just a second, and something passed between us. Not suspicion exactly, not yet, just a flicker of, that was a lot of words that said nothing. I didn't think about it again for over a year. That's the moment I go back to the most, if I'm being honest with you, because in hindsight, that wasn't him being embarrassed about being broke. It was him protecting information, and there's a difference between those two things that I wouldn't understand until much, much later. Somewhere around month 5, I asked Wes about his family, the way you do when things start getting serious. He told me his parents had a complicated divorce when he was young, that he'd basically raised himself from his teenage years on, bouncing between relatives, and that it left him not great at staying close to people, but really good at knowing who's worth staying close to. He said it with this vulnerable, almost embarrassed half smile, and I remember feeling this rush of protectiveness toward him, like I wanted to be the person who finally gave him something stable. I found out, much later, doing the kind of digging I never should have had to do, that most of that story doesn't hold together. His parents are still married. He has a brother he barely mentioned, ever, who I only learned existed because Dana ran into him once, years later, completely by accident at a hardware store 2 towns over. I don't know exactly what's true about Wes's childhood and what isn't, and honestly, at this point, I've stopped trying to figure it out. But I do know that complicated past is one of the most effective tools someone like Wes has, because it does 2 things at once. It explains away any inconsistency in someone's life story, and it makes you feel guilty for ever doubting them. By month 8, we were basically living together. He kept clothes at my place, his toothbrush was in my bathroom, and eventually I just said, "Why are we paying for 2 places? Move in officially." He said yes immediately, almost too immediately now that I think about it, like he'd been waiting for me to offer. And this is where things start to shift. Slowly, the way water shifts to ice. You don't see the exact moment it happens. You just wake up one day and everything's frozen. Once Wes moved in, his business took off, or at least that's what he told me. He started talking about a big client that required him to travel for meetings, sometimes overnight. I never met this client, I never saw a contract, but I also had my own job, my own life, my own friends. I wasn't tracking his calendar like a detective. Why would I? We were happy, or I thought we were. Around the 1-year mark, something happened that I want you to remember because it comes back around later in this story in a way that's going to make you furious. Wes asked me very casually over dinner if he could be added as an authorized user on my credit card. He said it was for building his business credit profile and that he'd pay me back for anything he charged. I said yes. I want to sit in that for a second, because I think a lot of you watching have done something similar. You love someone, you trust someone, and trust isn't supposed to require an audit. That's the whole point of it. But trust, when it's given to the wrong person, becomes a weapon they use against you. And I didn't know yet which kind of person Wes was. Over the next several months, small charges started appearing, 100 here, 200 there. He always had an explanation: software subscriptions, a networking dinner, a conference registration. I never really scrutinized it because, again, he always said he'd pay it back, and every couple of months he'd hand me an envelope of cash to cover it. I never counted it that closely. That's on me. But it's also exactly what someone counts on when they're setting up a con, that the person trusting them isn't going to count. Then came the isolation. This one crept up so slowly I didn't clock it as a pattern until I was writing this story out in my head years later, trying to understand what happened. It started with little comments. Priya seems like she doesn't really like me. Your sister's kind of judgmental, don't you think? I just feel like your friends don't want us to be happy. Nothing dramatic, nothing you could scream, that's abusive about in the moment. Just quiet little seeds planted over dinner, over pillow talk, over months. And slowly I started seeing my friends less. Not because Wes forbade it. He never once told me I couldn't see someone. He was smarter than that. He just made every gathering with them feel slightly uncomfortable, slightly tense, until it became easier not to go. There was also a strange, quiet asymmetry that developed around our phones that I didn't fully clock until much later. Wes always had his phone face down, always kept it on him even in the bathroom, and had a habit of tilting the screen away from me when notifications came in, all done so casually it never registered as strange in the moment. Meanwhile, he'd asked lightly, almost jokingly, to see funny texts from my coworkers or memes my sister sent, framing it as wanting to be included in my life. I never thought twice about handing him my phone. He never once handed me his, and I never once asked. I want to tell you about one specific night because I think about it more than almost anything else from those 2 years. It was around month 14. We'd had a small fight, nothing dramatic, just a disagreement about whether to go to my coworker's housewarming party. I wanted to go. Wes said he was exhausted, said the big client had been draining him all week, and asked if we could just stay in instead. I went without him, and when I came home about 3 hours later, he had cooked an entire dinner, candles lit, my favorite playlist on low in the background. He apologized for being distant lately and said he wanted to reconnect. It was genuinely one of the most romantic nights of my life at the time. I found out much later, going back through the timeline document, that the housewarming party I'd gone to alone that night fell on the exact same evening as the date night he'd had scheduled with Brianna for nearly 3 weeks. He wasn't exhausted from a big client. He was staying home to avoid the risk of me seeing something I shouldn't. And the romantic dinner wasn't reconnection. It was damage control, dressed up as intimacy, so I'd never think twice about where he really wanted to be that night. I bring this up because I think it's the clearest example of something I didn't have language for at the time. Every gesture that felt like love was actually strategy. Every time he pulled me closer, it was usually right after he'd needed to push someone else away, or cover something up, or buy himself another few weeks of not being caught. I couldn't see the strings. That's the whole design of it. You're not supposed to see the strings while you're the one being moved. There was another moment around month 16 at my mom's birthday dinner. Wes was, as always, incredibly charming at that table, refilled everyone's wine, complimented my mom's cooking, asked my stepdad detailed questions about his fishing trip that made the old man light up like I hadn't seen in years. Everyone at that table adored him. My mom pulled me into the kitchen afterward and said, "Kayla, you need to lock that one down before someone else does." I laughed and told her we were talking about moving in together, which, as you know, we already had. What I didn't know, what none of us at that table knew, was that Wes had 3 days earlier, according to the timeline document, toured the apartment across town with Brianna for the very first time. The same week he was charming my entire family into loving him, he was already apartment hunting for a life that didn't include any of us. I keep coming back to this idea of 2 timelines running side by side. The one I was living, full of birthday dinners and inside jokes and plans for a future, and the one he was actually building, quietly underneath all of it, like a second foundation poured directly beneath the house I thought we were constructing together. By 18 months in, my best friend Priya, who you're going to hear a lot about later because she becomes very, very important, pulled me aside at my cousin's wedding and said something I brushed off at the time. She said, "Kayla, I love you, and I need you to hear this once, and then I'll drop it forever if you want me to. Something about Wes doesn't add up. I don't know what it is yet, but I've never met a single person from his life, not a coworker, not a family member, not an old friend from before you. In 2 years, Kayla. Doesn't that seem strange to you? I got defensive. I told her she just didn't understand our relationship. I told her Wes had a complicated family, that his business friends were mostly online, that not everyone needed a big social circle. I believed every word I was saying. I want to pause here and just say something directly to you, watching this right now. If a friend who loves you says something like that to you, write it down somewhere. You don't have to act on it immediately, but write it down, because sometimes the people who love us can see the shape of a lie long before we're ready to see it ourselves. Priyan's warning sat in the back of my mind for the next 6 months, quiet, uncomfortable, like a splinter I kept meaning to deal with and never did. There was one night, around month 19, where I actually tried to bring it up with him directly, gently, not accusingly, just genuinely curious. I asked him why I'd never met any of his old friends, why there were no photos of him from before we met on any of his social media, why his family never came up in a way that felt like they were actual people I might someday meet. I remember his answer almost word for word because it was so smooth it startled me even in the moment. He said, "Kayla, I don't live in the past. I built this life, the one with you in it, on purpose. I don't need to drag old chapters into a story I'm actually proud of." And then he kissed my forehead and changed the subject to weekend plans. At the time, I thought that was one of the most romantic things anyone had ever said to me. Looking back, I understand it for what it actually was, a perfectly constructed non-answer dressed up as devotion, specifically engineered to make me feel guilty for ever asking a completely reasonable question in the first place. It worked. I didn't ask again for almost a year. Around month 20, 2 things happened within the same week that, on their own, I explained away, but that I now understand were the walls closing in from 2 different directions. The first was money. Wes asked to borrow $3,000 just for a month to cover what he called a cash flow gap with a supplier for a client project. He said he'd have it back to me by the 15th. I transferred it from my savings, the same account I'd been quietly building for a house down payment since before I even met him. He never brought it up again, and when I gently asked about it 2 months later, he got defensive in a way that was unusual for him. I said I'd handle it, Kayla. Can you not make me feel like a charity case right now? I apologized. I actually apologized for my own $3,000. That's a pattern I want to name directly because I think a lot of you watching have lived some version of it. Somewhere along the way in a relationship like this, the person taking from you gets so good at flipping the emotional script that you end up comforting them about the thing they took. I did that more than once. I got good at it without ever noticing I'd learned the skill. I brought that $3,000 up one more time, months later, half joking, trying to make it feel light so he wouldn't get defensive again. He laughed it off and said, "You worry about money more than anyone I've ever met. You know that?" It landed exactly the way I think he intended it to. I felt embarrassed, like caring about a debt he owed me was somehow a personality flaw I needed to work on, rather than a completely reasonable thing to want resolved. I never brought it up a third time. The second thing that happened that same week was smaller, but it's the one that actually made me feel something like fear, just for a moment before I buried it. I picked up his phone to check the time, mine was charging in the other room, and saw a text notification preview flash across the lock screen. It was a name I didn't recognize, just a first name, no last name, no context. The preview said something like, "Can't wait to see the place Saturday, it's going to be perfect." I didn't open it. I didn't even ask him about it directly. I told myself it was probably about a coworker's apartment or a client's site visit. I set the phone back down exactly where I found it. Looking back, that text was almost certainly about the apartment tour with Brianna I mentioned earlier. The same one or one very close to it in timing. And the version of me sitting on that couch that night had the truth land directly in her lap, glowing on a phone screen, and chose to set it back down face first and go make dinner instead. I'm not telling you this to make myself sound foolish. I'm telling you because I think almost everyone watching this has had a moment like that, a small flicker of truth that your gut recognized before your heart was ready to. And I want you to know, if you're in that moment right now watching this video because something in your own life feels a little too familiar, you're allowed to pick the phone back up. You're allowed to ask the question twice. I didn't, not then. It would take 4 more months and one open laptop on a Thursday afternoon before the truth finally stopped waiting politely for me to notice it. And then, right around our 2-year anniversary, the same week we were supposed to go on a trip to Charleston to celebrate, everything I thought I knew about my relationship came apart in the space of about 4 hours. But that's Act 2. And trust me, you are not ready for what I found in that email. But what happened next, I never saw coming. Act 2, the betrayal. It was a Thursday. I remember that specifically because Thursdays were my early days at work and I'd gotten home by 4 p.m., which never happened. I was excited, actually. I wanted to surprise Wes and start packing for Charleston a day early. He wasn't home. His laptop was sitting open on the kitchen table, which was unusual. Wes was religious about closing his laptop, always, even to grab a glass of water. I didn't think anything of it at first. I just went to close it myself so it wouldn't die on the counter. And that's when I saw the email. It was open, right there on the screen, no digging required, no snooping, nothing I had to go looking for, just sitting there like it had been left for me to find, though I'd realize later it hadn't been left for me at all. He'd simply gotten sloppy because he never imagined I'd come home 4 hours early. The subject line said, "Re-lease confirmation. Move in this Saturday." I remember reading it 3 times before my brain would actually process what it said. It was from a leasing office, addressed to Wesley Carrington, confirming a 1-bedroom apartment across town. Move-in date 2 days away. My hands were actually shaking. I scrolled up in the thread, and that's when I saw her name for the first time, Brianna. The email chain went back weeks. Wes and this leasing office CCing someone named Brianna Whitfield, discussing the deposit, the move-in inspection, whether the unit allowed dogs. In one email, dated about a month earlier, Wes had written, and I am never going to forget these exact words, "This is going to be a fresh start for both of us. New city, new chapter, no complications." New city. He was planning to leave Columbus. I sat down at that kitchen table and I just started opening everything. His email still logged in, his browser history still open in another tab. And what I found over the next 40 minutes rewrote the entire 2 years I thought I'd lived. Brianna wasn't new. The earliest message between them was from 14 months earlier. 14 months while he was living in my apartment, sleeping in my bed, eating dinner across from me every night. 14 months of a full parallel relationship I had absolutely no idea existed. I want to slow down here because I know some of you are already yelling at your screen. I was too, sitting there, alone, in the apartment we shared, reading messages between the man I loved and a woman I'd never heard of, describing a life together that apparently had been under construction the entire time he was building a different one with me. There were photos, trips I didn't know about, a weekend in Asheville he told me was a solo work retreat, a dinner at a restaurant downtown the same week he told me he was stuck on a client call and couldn't make my work holiday party. In one photo, he had his arm around her on what was unmistakably a hiking trail, the same trail he told me he hated hiking and never wanted to go to with me. I scrolled through months of messages between them, and what struck me wasn't even the romance of it, though there was plenty of that. It was how ordinary it all sounded. complaints about a slow morning at work, a shared joke about a TV show, a quick thinking about you sent on a random Tuesday afternoon. It read exactly like a real relationship because it was one, just one running in complete secrecy parallel to mine for over a year. There was no dramatic villain monologue moment in any of those messages, just a man quietly, methodically building a second normal life, one boring, sweet, everyday text message at a time, while coming home to tell me about his day like nothing else existed. He hated hiking with me. He apparently loved it with her. That's such a small, stupid detail, and it's the one that broke something in me that day. Not the apartment, not the money, that hiking trail. I kept reading, and this is where it stopped being about heartbreak and started being about something colder. Because buried in an email from about 10 months back, Wes had written to Brianna about getting his finances in order before the move. And in that same email, he referenced something that made my stomach turn over completely. He called it Kayla's card, not my card, not our card, mine. He wrote, and again, I will never forget this, once the business credit is built up enough on Kayla's card, I'll be able to walk away clean and not need it anymore, just a few more months. I want you to sit with that for a second, the way I had to sit with it. Every charge over the past year and a half, the software subscriptions, the conference registrations, the networking dinners, none of that was for a real business. There was no business. I went looking right then at that kitchen table for any actual evidence of client work, contracts, invoices, a single dollar of real income. There was nothing. 14 months of charges on my credit card and not one shred of proof that the business had ever made a cent. Before I checked the savings account, I sat for a second just staring at that Kayla's card line, feeling something shift permanently in my chest. 2 years of my life reduced to a resource he'd been quietly draining and labeling with clinical detachment, like I was a line item in a spreadsheet instead of a person he claimed to love. I remember thinking very clearly in that exact moment, whatever version of Wes I fell in love with, it was never the person actually living in this apartment with me. I checked my joint savings account next, the one we'd opened together for our future, where I'd been putting away $200 a paycheck for over a year for a house down payment. Wes had access as a joint account holder. I don't even know why I checked it. Some instinct. It was nearly empty. $11,300, withdrawn in increments over the past 5 months, small enough each time that I never noticed on a shared statement I honestly didn't check as closely as I should have. $11,000. Gone. Into an account I couldn't even trace from where I was sitting. I actually laughed, out loud, alone in that kitchen, not because anything was funny. I think it was just my brain trying to process something too big to hold all at once. And then, this is the I can't believe this moment, the first one. I found a folder on his laptop labeled, and I am not making this up, Fresh Start Docs. Inside it were drafts of things, a draft resignation letter from a job I didn't even know he'd taken 3 months earlier at a logistics company that he never once mentioned to me, a draft text message to a landlord about breaking a different lease, and a document titled Timeline, with dates going back almost a full year mapping out, I'm gonna say this plainly, mapping out his exit. He had a spreadsheet for leaving me. Second, I can't believe this moment, the Timeline document had a line item dated just 2 weeks earlier that said, Charleston trip, good cover, use for final large purchases before transition. He was planning to use our anniversary trip, the trip I'd been looking forward to months, the trip I thought was a celebration of us, as an opportunity to max out charges on my card before disappearing. I felt sick. physically, actually sick. I want to tell you what I did in that moment because I think it matters. I didn't scream. I didn't throw anything, though God knows I wanted to. I didn't call him screaming. I sat there in total silence and I started taking screenshots. Every email, every message, every document in that folder. I didn't fully know why yet. I just knew on some animal level that I was going to need proof of what I was looking at because a part of my brain was already whispering that this man was going to try to make me doubt what I'd seen. I photographed the laptop screen with my phone, too, in case he deleted things before I could screenshot everything. I want you to remember that instinct because it's going to matter a lot in about 20 minutes of this video. I kept digging because once I started, I couldn't make myself stop. I found the actual folder for the consulting business, the real one, not the Fresh Start Docs folder. It had exactly 4 files in it. A logo he'd apparently paid someone $40 for on a freelance site, a business card design that had never been sent to a printer based on the file's creation date sitting untouched for over a year, a template email signature, and one single invoice dated back to nearly the very beginning of our relationship made out to a company that, when I searched it 20 minutes later, didn't appear to exist anywhere. No website, no registration, nothing. I think now that he made that one invoice up early on, specifically so that if I ever asked to see proof his business was real, he'd have something to show me. He never showed me that invoice, not once in 2 years, because he never actually needed to. I never asked. That's the part that still sits heavy with me. Not that he built a lie, but how little maintenance the lie actually required because I'd already decided somewhere in the first 6 months that I trusted him completely. I called my younger sister Dana next, before I even called Priya, because Dana lived 20 minutes away, and I think some animal part of my brain just needed family first. She came straight over, and I remember her standing in my kitchen reading the timeline document over my shoulder, going completely silent in a way my sister never goes silent. Dana is loud. Dana has an opinion about everything, and she just stood there, hand over her mouth, for almost a full minute. Then she said something that I've held on to ever since. "Kayla, I need you to hear me. This isn't about you not being enough. Whatever this is, it was never about you not being enough." I didn't believe her yet, not fully, not that day. When someone lies to you for 14 months, some small, wounded part of you goes looking for the version where it's your fault, where if you'd just been prettier or more interesting or less busy with work, none of this would have happened. It takes a while to unlearn that instinct. I want to say directly to anyone watching this who's been through something similar, it was never about you not being enough either. People like Wes don't leave because someone failed to be enough. They leave and lie and scheme because taking is simply what they do, regardless of who's standing in front of them. Dana stayed for almost an hour, mostly just sitting with me, occasionally muttering something under her breath about Wes that I won't repeat here. Before she left, practical as always underneath all that fire, she made me eat something, made sure I had her on speed dial, and told me to call her the second Wes walked back through that door, no matter what time it was. "You don't have to handle tonight alone," she said. "You just have to get through the next few hours. I'll help you handle everything after that." Third, I can't believe this moment, and honestly, this is the one that still gets me. I texted Priya, just one line, "I need you to come over right now. Don't ask why yet." She was at my door in 11 minutes, and when I opened the door and she saw my face, she didn't say, "I told you so," not once. Not that day, not ever, actually, and I love her for that. She just wrapped her arms around me and said, "Okay, tell me everything, and then tell me what you want to do about it." We sat at that same kitchen table for almost 2 hours, going through everything on Wes's laptop before he could get home and possibly notice it had been touched. Priya read the Fresh Start Docs folder in near silence, her jaw tightening with every scroll. At one point, she just stopped, put her hand flat on the table and said, Kayla, I need you to know something. This isn't a guy who made a bad decision. This is a guy who built an entire operating system for lying to you. There's a difference, and I need you to see it before he gets home and tries to convince you there isn't. I asked her at one point, voice shaking, was it ever real? Any of it? And she said something I've turned over in my head 1,000 times since. I don't know if it was real to him, but it doesn't actually matter, because what matters is it was real to you, and he knew that, and he used it anyway. That's the part that makes this different from just falling out of love. I want to be honest about how I felt in that moment, because I don't think grief and rage always show up the way movies make you expect. I didn't feel like screaming. I felt strangely, terrifyingly calm. The kind of calm that I now understand was probably shock, my brain protecting me from the full size of what I just learned by only letting a little of it through at a time. Priya recognized it. She'd seen a friend go through something similar years before, and she gently told me, "You don't have to feel it all today. You're allowed to be functional right now and fall apart later. Both are normal." She was right. I would fall apart later, plenty of times over the following months. But that night, in that kitchen, with the decision to make in the next few hours before Wes walked back through that door, functional was exactly what I needed to be. Before he came home, Priya asked me one more thing, gently, almost like she was afraid of the answer. She asked if I wanted her to stay in the apartment with me when he walked in, just in case. I told her no, not because I felt safe exactly. Wes had never been physically threatening, not once in 2 years, but because I needed him to see nothing different in me yet. I needed one more day of him believing he still had the upper hand, so that when it finally came apart, it would come apart entirely on my terms, not his. She left around 6:30, hugging me at the door for a long time, and made me promise to text her the second he left for work the next morning. I remember standing in that kitchen alone for a few minutes after she left, looking at the exact spot where I'd found that open laptop just hours earlier, and feeling like the apartment itself had changed shape around me, smaller somehow, and colder, even though nothing physical had moved at all. Wes came home around 7 that evening, completely unaware that his entire double life had just detonated in his own kitchen. And I need to tell you, everything I did in the next hour I planned in the 90 minutes before he walked through that door. Because Priya asked me one question that changed the entire trajectory of this story. She asked, "Do you want him to know you know, or do you want to actually get something out of this first?" And that question, that single question, is the moment this story stopped being about a broken heart and started being about a plan. I let him walk in that door like it was any other Thursday. I smiled. I asked about his day. He had no idea that I now knew every single lie he told me for 14 months. He had no idea I had photographic proof of an apartment lease, a second relationship, drained savings, and a spreadsheet with my name in it under a column labeled Cover Story. I looked him dead in the eye and said, "So, are we still leaving for Charleston Saturday?" He smiled back at me and said yes. I want to tell you what the rest of that Thursday night actually looked like, because I think it matters. We ordered Thai food. We watched half of an episode of a show we'd been working through together. He fell asleep with his head on my shoulder around 9:30, completely at peace, completely unaware that the woman he was leaning on had spent the entire evening cataloging the collapse of everything he thought he'd gotten away with. I sat there for almost an hour after he fell asleep, just staring at the wall, running the math in my head. 14 months of secret texts, $11,300 gone from savings I'd built paycheck by paycheck, an apartment lease with another woman's name on it 2 days from move-in, a hiking trip to Asheville I wasn't invited to, a spreadsheet with a column labeled Cover Story and my name sitting right there under it, reduced to a line item in someone else's escape plan. I didn't cry that night. I want to be honest about that because I think people expect the crying to come first, and for me, it didn't. The crying came later, weeks later, in waves I didn't see coming, usually triggered by something small and stupid, a song, a restaurant we used to go to, the specific brand of coffee creamer he liked. That first night, all I felt was a kind of cold, clear stillness, like my whole body had decided grief could wait until it was safe to feel it. Friday, he went about his normal routine, or what I now understood was his routine, a life running on two separate tracks that somehow never crossed in front of me. He said he had a client call in the afternoon. I now believe, based on the timeline document's dates, that call was almost certainly a final logistics conversation with Brianna's leasing office, or possibly with Brianna herself, finalizing move-in details for a life he thought he was 2 days away from starting clean. I spent that Friday afternoon in a Panera parking lot, on the phone with an attorney, which I'll get into in the next part of this story, quietly building the foundation of a plan that Wes had absolutely no idea was already under construction, 6 feet away from him in the same apartment he was still calling home. He was going to use my own anniversary trip to rob me one last time before disappearing into a new life with another woman. And I was going to let him think he could. Because what he didn't know, what nobody in that apartment knew yet except me and Priya, is that I wasn't going to be the one who got left holding nothing. I was going to make sure that when Wesley Carrington's fresh start finally arrived, there'd be absolutely nothing fresh left of it. But what happened next, I never saw coming. Act 3, the plan. 30 minutes to 45 minutes. I need to tell you something up front about this part of the story because I think it's important. I did not want to destroy Wes out of spite. I want to be honest with you about that even now. What I wanted was simple. I wanted my money back. I wanted proof, real, undeniable proof, so that when I confronted him, he couldn't twist it, minimize it, or gaslight me into thinking I had misunderstood something. And somewhere underneath that, if I'm being fully honest, I wanted him to feel, just once, a fraction of the instability he'd built his entire relationship with me on top of. But revenge, real revenge, the kind that actually works and doesn't blow up in your own face, that's not about rage. Rage makes you sloppy. What I needed was patience, and I had exactly 2 days before we were supposed to leave for Charleston to build a plan that could actually hold up. Step 1, documentation. That night, after Wes went to sleep, sleeping soundly, I might add, like a man who had no idea his entire secret life had just been discovered 6 feet away from him, I sat in the bathroom with my phone and I built what Priya and I started calling the file. Every screenshot, every email, bank statements I pulled directly from my own online banking, time-stamped, official, unmistakable, the timeline document in full, the lease confirmation, everything. I emailed the entire file to myself, to Priya, and to a personal email address Wes had no access to and didn't know existed. I wanted redundancy. I wanted this to exist in at least 3 places that he could never touch. Step 2, I needed to understand what I was actually dealing with financially and legally. The next morning, I told Wes I had a work thing, and instead I sat in the parking lot of a Panera and called a consumer protection attorney a coworker had recommended years earlier for something unrelated. I explained the situation, the joint savings account, the authorized user credit card, the withdrawals, and what she told me changed the entire shape of my plan. Because I was the primary account holder on both, the money he'd moved was, legally, money he had access to but had used in ways I could absolutely document and dispute. Since the account was joint account holders technically have equal claim to funds, even if morally, obviously, that money was mine, built from my paychecks. But the credit card? That was different. He was an authorized user, not an owner. Every charge on that card, if I could show it was for his personal use and not disclosed or repaid as agreed, was something I could dispute, and more importantly, something I could remove him from access to immediately. She told me one sentence that I still think about. The money matters, but the paper trail matters more. If this man has done this before or does it again, your documentation could be the thing that actually protects someone else. That sentence planted something in me that would matter a lot more later than I understood in that moment. She also warned me to be extremely careful about how I handled the next 48 hours, legally speaking. She specifically cautioned me against anything that could be construed as harassment, unauthorized account access beyond what I was legally entitled to as the primary holder, or destruction of shared property. "You have a strong position right now," she said. "Don't weaken it by getting emotional and doing something you can't undo. The goal is to make sure every move you make from here is one you could explain calmly to a judge, a bank, or your own mother without flinching." I wrote that down on a napkin in that parking lot. I still have it, folded up in a drawer at home. Every move, explainable, calmly to a judge, a bank, or your mother. That single sentence became the filter for every decision I made for the rest of this story. Before I sent a message, before I made a call, before I asked Priya to reach out to Brianna, I ran it through that filter. Could I explain this calmly? Was I acting on information I actually had, verified and documented? Or was I acting on a feeling I hadn't confirmed yet? It sounds almost clinical describing it now, but it's exactly what kept this from turning into something messier, something that could have backfired on me legally or emotionally in ways I wouldn't have been able to undo. I spent part of that Friday night, after Wes had gone to bed, drafting the message I knew I'd eventually need to send him, the one that would finally tell him I knew everything. I wrote probably a dozen versions. Some were angrier than I want to admit out loud. Some tried to be cutting, clever, the kind of thing you'd imagine saying in a movie right before dramatic music swells. I deleted every one of those versions because somewhere around draft 8, I realized what I actually wanted him to feel wasn't wounded pride. I wanted him to understand, clearly and completely, that the game was over and that there was nothing left to manipulate his way out of. The version I finally settled on was short, flat, and factual. No insults, no emotional appeals, just the truth laid out plainly enough that there was no room left for him to spin it into something else. I saved it in my notes app, ready to send at the exact moment it would do the most good. I didn't know yet that it would take less than 72 hours to use it. I also want to walk you through how Priya actually found Sarah, because I think it's worth understanding how much of this was simple, patient, completely legal groundwork rather than anything dramatic. Priya started with an old email signature buried in one of the draft documents in the Fresh Start Docs folder, one that referenced an apartment complex in Cincinnati Wes had apparently lived in before he and I ever met. From there, she searched public records and old social media tags around that time frame. Nothing private, nothing hacked, just the ordinary digital footprint most of us leave behind without ever thinking about it. She found a woman tagged in old photos at that same complex around the right window of time and took a chance on a direct, gentle message. She told me later she almost didn't send it, worried it would come across as invasive to a total stranger. But she said something to herself that I still think about. If I'm wrong, she ignores a strange message from someone she doesn't know. If I'm right, she might finally get some kind of closure. Sarah wrote back within the hour. Around that same time, Priya was also quietly cross-referencing the logistics company job Wes had never told me about. She found his profile on a professional networking site, updated just 2 months earlier, listing a business degree from a university in the Midwest and a job title that sounded a lot more senior than anything I ever saw evidence of in real life. Something about the dates didn't sit right with her. The graduation year listed didn't line up with an age gap Wes had mentioned once, almost a year earlier, about being a couple years behind his college friends because of some family stuff. She spent about an hour on a public alumni verification tool that a lot of universities offer, mostly used by employers doing background checks, and confirmed what her gut had already told her. No record of a Wesley Carrington graduating in that year or any year within a reasonable window around it. Not a scandal, not a smoking gun on its own. Plenty of people attend without finishing. Plenty of people round up on a resume in ways that are unwise, but not exactly criminal. But stacked next to everything else, it was one more piece of a pattern that was becoming impossible to ignore. Almost nothing Wes had told anyone ever about his own life appeared to be entirely true. Step 3. Cutting him off quietly without tipping my hand. I called my credit card company from that same parking lot and removed Wes as an authorized user, effective immediately. I didn't cancel the card or change the number yet. I just made sure that from that moment forward, not one more dollar of my credit could move through his hands. I also called and requested a temporary reduction on the credit limit itself, framing it to the representative as wanting to manage spending during a life transition, which in its own strange way was completely true. I brought the limit down to just a few $100s over what I estimated our normal weekend expenses in Charleston would run. Enough that nothing would look suspicious if Wes tried to use the card for dinner or gas. Not nearly enough for him to pull off whatever larger, final withdrawal he might have been planning based on that line in his timeline document about using the trip for final large purchases before transition. I sat in that car afterward for a long time before starting the engine. I remember looking at myself in the rear-view mirror and not quite recognizing the version of me staring back. Someone capable of sitting this still, planning this precisely 24 hours after finding out the last 2 years of her life were built on a lie. I think that's the part nobody prepares you for. Not the heartbreak itself, but discovering a version of your own strength you never knew you had, right when you need it most. Then I did something that took every ounce of self-control I had. I went home and I acted completely normal. I want to talk about what that actually felt like, because it's the hardest thing I've ever done. Sitting across from someone at dinner, someone who spent 14 months lying to your face and passing him the salt like nothing's wrong. Watching him talk about how excited he was for Charleston, knowing exactly why he was excited, knowing it had nothing to do with me and everything to do with one last spending spree before he vanished into a new zip code with someone named Brianna. There was a moment Friday night, packing for the trip, where he actually said to me, and I want you to hear how casually cruel this is, "This weekend's gonna be one to remember, babe." He kissed my forehead when he said it. I smiled and said, "You have no idea." Step 4. Priya. Here's where my best friend went from support system to full co-conspirator, and honestly, some of you are going to love her by the end of this. Priya works in HR for a mid-sized company, and she has this incredible ability to just find information legally through public records, professional networking sites, and a genuinely terrifying amount of patience. While I kept up appearances at home, Priya was digging into 2 things: who Brianna actually was, and whether Fresh Start Docs folder meant this was Wes's first time running this exact playbook, or whether there was a pattern. It took her about 36 hours to find something that stopped both of us cold. Wes had done this before. 2 years before he met me, so roughly 4.5 years before this story, there had been a woman named Sarah in Cincinnati. Priya found her through a mutual connection on a professional networking site, and after some careful, gentle outreach, Priya as a gift for making people trust her almost instantly, Sarah actually responded. And what Sarah told her, relayed to me almost verbatim, made my blood run cold. Wes had lived with Sarah for nearly 2 years. He'd run a nearly identical version of the same scheme, an up-and-coming business, authorized user status on her credit card, and a joint savings account that mysteriously drained over time, and finally, a sudden, unexplained disappearance while Sarah was traveling for her sister's baby shower. Sarah came home to an empty side of the closet and about $6,000 gone from savings she never fully recovered. Sarah told Priya something that has stuck with me every day since. I thought I was the only one stupid enough to fall for it. I used to think there was something wrong with me for not seeing it coming. There was nothing wrong with Sarah. There was nothing wrong with me. There was something deeply, deliberately wrong with a man who had built an entire second identity out of doing this to women over and over and walking away clean every single time because none of us ever compared notes. That was the moment my plan shifted from get my money back to something bigger. Because if this was a pattern, and Brianna right now was very likely about to become his next Sarah, his next me, then quietly disappearing with my dignity intact wasn't enough anymore. I made a decision that Priya questioned at first, and honestly, I understand why. I decided I wasn't going to warn Brianna in secret and let her make her own choice about a man who was, as far as she knew, mid-breakup with an ex named Kayla. I decided the most powerful thing I could do wasn't to blow up his relationship with her out of jealousy. It was to hand her the truth, completely and without spin, and let her see exactly who she was moving in with, using the same documentation, the same file that I'd already built for myself. Because here's what I understood sitting in that Panera parking lot 2 days earlier. The version of this story where I just scream at him, throw his stuff on the lawn, and cry for 6 months, that's the version where he wins. He gets to walk away, tell Brianna his ex was unstable or controlling, and start the exact same con all over again. Clean slate, no consequences. The version where I stayed calm, documented everything, and made sure the truth reached every single person it needed to reach, that's the version where the pattern finally breaks. Step 5. The actual plan laid out. Here's what Priya and I decided sitting at my kitchen table Friday night while Wes was in the shower, humming, completely oblivious. We would still go to Charleston. I wasn't going to tip him off by canceling. I needed him relaxed, confident, and unaware for what came next. While we were there, I planned to let him make exactly the kind of charges his timeline document predicted on a card I had already quietly reduced the credit limit on that Friday afternoon with one phone call, enough that he could spend some, enough to feel normal, but nowhere close to what he was expecting to walk away with. Meanwhile, back in Columbus, Priya would reach out to Brianna directly the day we were set to return with the full documented file. The emails, the lease, the timeline, and Sarah's story. I would also, once we returned, go directly to my bank with the full documentation and formally dispute every unauthorized charge tied to his authorized user status, something the attorney confirmed I had every legal right to do given the paper trail we now had. And there was one more piece. Priya had found, buried in the Fresh Start Docs folder, something Wes had apparently forgotten was even in there, a reference to the logistics company job he'd quietly taken 3 months earlier, the one he never told me about. Turns out, on his application, he'd claimed a business degree from a university he never actually graduated from and cited 2 years of consulting experience that, as far as we could tell, never happened outside his fake business with my money. I wasn't going to break any laws to use that information. I want to be crystal clear about that because I know some of you are already thinking about hacking or harassment or something dramatic. I didn't need to do anything illegal. I simply needed to make sure that the truth, verifiable, documented, real truth, ended up in front of the people who had a right to know it before they trusted him with their savings, their homes, or their careers. Friday night, after the plan was set, Dana called me, worried, because I'd been quiet in our group text all day. I told her everything, the plan, the file, Charleston, all of it. She went silent for a second, and then she said something that actually made me laugh for the first time in 2 days. Kayla, I need you to know that I am insanely proud of you, and also slightly terrified of you right now, and I mean both of those things as a compliment. She asked me the question I think mattered most out of everyone in those 2 days. She asked, "Are you doing this because you want him to hurt or because you want this to actually be over, clean, on your terms?" I thought about it for a long moment before I answered her, and what I landed on was this. I didn't need Wes to suffer in some cosmic, dramatic way. What I needed was for the version of events where he simply vanished, guilt-free, into a brand new life, while I was left picking up the financial and emotional wreckage. I needed that version to be impossible. I needed the truth to exist somewhere he couldn't erase it, in the hands of people who deserve to have it. That was never about revenge for revenge's sake. That was about making sure the story didn't end with him getting away clean, the way he apparently always had. Dana said, "Then you're not being vengeful. You're just refusing to disappear quietly. Those are different things, and don't let anyone, including yourself, tell you they're the same." Friday night, after the plan was set, I zipped up my suitcase, put on sunglasses so Wes couldn't see my eyes too closely, and got in the car for a 4-hour drive to Charleston with a man who thought he was about to disappear into a new life. He had no idea the woman sitting next to him already knew every secret he had. He had no idea her best friend was, at that exact moment, 300 miles away, preparing to make sure his fresh start collapsed before it ever had the chance to begin. He turned to me at a rest stop outside of Huntington, West Virginia, smiled that smile that used to make my whole chest go warm, and said, "I feel like this trip is going to change everything." I smiled back. "You have no idea how right you are." But what happened next, I never saw coming. Act 4. Execution and Payoff. Charleston was, in a strange way, one of the most surreal weekends of my life. We walked cobblestone streets. We ate shrimp and grits at a restaurant he picked because it had a good vibe for us. He held my hand crossing the street. And every single moment, I knew something he didn't, that this was the last weekend of a relationship that on his end had already been over for months. He tried to use my card twice that weekend, once for a surprise dinner reservation that came out to just under $400, and once for what he called a little something for the road. I later found out that was a deposit on a U-Haul rental for the following week. Both charges went through, just under the new lower limit I'd quietly set. He had no idea he was spending against a ceiling I'd already built specifically to contain him. Sunday morning, driving home, he got a text and got quiet for a minute, then said he had a work thing he needed to sort out when we got back. I already knew, from the timeline document, that Monday was supposed to be his last day at our apartment, officially. He was going to tell me some story about a business trip and simply never come back. I dropped him off at the apartment Sunday evening, told him I needed to run to the pharmacy, and drove straight to Priya's. Here's where everything I'd built for the past 3 days finally moved. Priya had already reached out to Brianna 2 hours earlier while Wes and I were on the road. She didn't send an angry message. She didn't accuse her of anything. She simply said, "My name is Priya. I'm a close friend of a woman named Kayla who has been in a relationship with Wesley Carrington for the past 2 years. I believe you may be unknowingly involved in something you deserve to know the truth about before you sign a lease with him this week. I have documentation. No pressure to respond, but I think you'll want to see this." Brianna responded in 11 minutes. And this is where the story takes a turn I genuinely did not see coming. And I promise you, when I tell you what Brianna said, some of you are going to feel something you did not expect to feel in this story. Brianna wasn't some scheming other woman who knew exactly what she was doing. She was, in almost every way, me, just 14 months behind. She'd met Wes at a networking event. He told her he was recently out of a long relationship that had run its course. He told her about his consulting business. He'd been asking her gently over the past 2 months about maybe combining finances once we're settled, and had already asked to be added to a small business credit card she'd opened. She sent Priya something that made both of us sit in stunned silence for a full minute. A photo from 6 weeks earlier of Wes standing in her kitchen, and behind him, barely visible, was a moving box labeled in his handwriting. The label said, "Fresh Start, Kayla Stuff, Donate." He had already started packing up mementos of 2 years of my life, labeling them for donation, while he was still coming home to me every single night. Brianna read through the entire file Priya sent her, the emails, the timeline document, Sarah's story from Cincinnati, over the course of about 40 minutes, and then she called Priya directly, crying so hard Priya said she could barely understand her at first. She said, "I was supposed to sign my lease renewal notice Tuesday to end my current place and move in with him Saturday. I already gave my landlord notice." Here's your first yes moment, and I mean that. This is where I want you leaning into your screen. Brianna didn't hang up and cry alone in a corner. She got angry in the productive way, the way I wish I'd gotten angry faster back on day one. She called her landlord that same night and, because her notice hadn't been formally processed yet, managed to rescind it before the deadline passed. She canceled the Saturday moving truck, and she told Priya something I will never forget. "Tell Kayla I'm not moving in with him, and tell her thank you. She has no idea what she just saved me from." 2 women who had never met, who Wes had spent over a year deliberately keeping in separate sealed-off compartments of his life, found each other in one night because of a single decision to tell the truth instead of staying silent. Priya told me later that Brianna kept apologizing during that call, over and over, saying things like, "I'm so sorry, I had no idea, I would never have done this if I'd known." I want to say directly for anyone listening who's ever found themselves the other woman in a situation you didn't know you were part of, Brianna had absolutely nothing to apologize for, and neither did she owe me. She was lied to just as thoroughly as I was. If anything, the only difference between us was 14 months of a head start and the sheer luck of a laptop being left open on a Thursday afternoon. I actually asked Priya to pass along a message to her, one I'd thought about carefully. I said, "Tell her she doesn't need to apologize to me. Tell her the only person either of us needs to be angry at just walked in the door of my apartment 40 minutes ago, completely unaware that his whole world is about to fall apart." Monday morning, while Wes was still asleep, thinking he had one more day before his planned disappearing act, I went to my bank in person with the full physical printout of the file, every email, every statement, the timeline document, and formally disputed every unauthorized charge tied to his authorized user status over the previous 14 months. Because I had documentation with actual dates, actual admission in his own words that the charges were personal and not for a legitimate shared purpose, the bank opened a formal fraud investigation that same day and immediately suspended his access to the card entirely. I also, that same morning, removed him from the lease on our apartment, which was and had always been solely in my name. I called a locksmith for that afternoon. I want to walk you through what that fraud dispute conversation actually looked like because I think it matters. The bank's fraud department asked me a series of very direct questions. Was I aware of the charges? Had I authorized them? Was there any indication they were used for purposes other than what was agreed upon? And for the first time in this entire story, I got to answer those questions with complete, documented honesty and watch someone in a position of actual authority take it seriously. The representative told me plainly, "Based on what you've provided, this looks like a clear pattern of misuse. We'll open an investigation and you should see provisional credit within 10 business days." It was such a small procedural sentence, and it still made my eyes sting, because it was the first time since Thursday that someone official had looked at what happened to me and simply confirmed, yes, this was real, and yes, you have every right to get it back. While I was at the bank, Priya went to the apartment and helped me pack Wes's belongings into boxes, not scattered on a lawn, not thrown out a window, nothing dramatic or destructive, just neatly boxed exactly the way I'd want my own things handled if the situation were reversed, because I wasn't interested in giving him a single thing to point to later and call erratic or vindictive. Everything went into the hallway outside our unit, stacked, labeled, untouched otherwise. Here's your second yes moment. Around 2 p.m., Wes texted me, "Hey, weird, my card got declined at lunch. Can you check on that?" I let it sit unanswered for exactly 47 minutes while a locksmith finished changing every lock in the apartment. Then I texted back 4 words, "Check your email, Wes." I had sent him, at that exact moment, a single message containing screenshots of the timeline document, the lease confirmation with Brianna's name on it, Sarah's story from Cincinnati, and a final line that I'd rewritten probably 15 times the night before, trying to get it exactly right. It said, "I know everything. I know about Brianna, I know about the money, I know about Sarah in Cincinnati, and I know this isn't the first time you've done this. Your things are packed in the hallway outside our building. The locks have been changed. Don't come back." He called 11 times in the next hour. I didn't answer once. And here's your third yes moment. The one that honestly still makes me feel something close to peace when I think about it. That evening, Wes showed up at Brianna's apartment, the one he was supposed to be moving into with her that Saturday, probably hoping to fall back on his backup plan now that his primary plan had collapsed. She didn't let him pass the front door. She told Priya later that she simply said, "I know everything too. Don't ever contact me again." And she shut the door. For the first time in over 4 years, going back through me and back through Sarah in Cincinnati before me, Wesley Carrington had absolutely nowhere to land. Now, here's the twist I promised you at the start of this video, the one I said you weren't ready for. Remember that logistics company job he'd quietly taken 3 months earlier, the one with the fake business degree on the application? Priya, in the course of her research, had found the HR contact information for that company's hiring department, publicly available, nothing hacked, nothing illegal, just information anyone could find with enough patience. She didn't reach out with rage. She simply sent a short professional message noting that the company might want to verify the educational credentials listed on a recent hire's application, given some inconsistencies that had come to light. She attached nothing accusatory, just a polite suggestion to double-check. I found out 3 weeks later, through a very roundabout way, a mutual acquaintance who still followed Wes's mother on social media, that Wes had been let go from that job, officially for credential discrepancies discovered during a routine background verification. Unofficially, everyone who knew him understood exactly what that meant. I didn't feel triumphant when I heard that news, which honestly surprised me. I thought I'd feel something closer to victory. Instead, I mostly just felt a strange, quiet exhale. This sense of a chapter finally, actually closing, rather than continuing to unravel slowly for months the way it had been. It wasn't about watching him suffer. It was about knowing that the version of him that walked into that job interview, lying easily and confidently about a life he never lived, wasn't going to be able to walk into the next one quite so cleanly either, not without someone, somewhere, eventually asking the right question. He lost the girlfriend he was building a fresh start with. He lost access to the credit that had quietly been funding his lifestyle for over a year. He lost the job he'd lied his way into, and because the business had never been real to begin with, no clients, no income, no savings of his own, nothing but a name on a spreadsheet titled Fresh Start, he had nothing underneath any of it to fall back on. Word came back to me in pieces over the following months, mostly through people who still knew people in his old circle. He'd bounced between a couple of short-term situations, a coworker's couch briefly, a distant cousin's spare room for a few weeks. Every arrangement seemed to end the same way from what I heard. Charm running out faster than welcome, patterns people eventually saw through, the same way Brianna and Sarah and I eventually had. Sarah called me directly about a month after everything unfolded, the first time we'd ever actually spoken instead of communicating through Priya. I was nervous before that call in a way I hadn't expected to be. Some part of me worried she'd resent me for stirring up a chapter of her life she'd spent years trying to close. Instead, she spent the first 10 minutes just thanking me over and over in a way that started to feel less like gratitude and more like relief. She told me she'd spent years wondering if there was something uniquely broken about her that made him leave the way he did. Hearing that it happened to me too, in almost the exact same pattern, years later, was the first time she said she actually felt believed. We talked for almost 2 hours that night. Somewhere in there, one of us, I honestly don't remember which, joked that we should start a support group, and the other one laughed and said, "Please, God, let Wes be the last member we ever have to recruit for it." It was dark humor, but it was also the first time either of us had been able to laugh about any of it, and I think that mattered more than either of us said out loud. Which brings us back to that Tuesday night, 3 years after I changed the locks, rain coming down, 2 garbage bags at the curb holding everything he owned, and Wesley Carrington standing on my porch saying my name like it still meant something to him. I want to tell you exactly what I did because I think it matters more than anything else in this story. I opened the door about 6 inches, enough to see him clearly, not enough to invite him in. For a second, neither of us said anything, just the sound of rain hitting the porch roof and 3 years of silence sitting between us like something physical. I noticed his hands were shaking, and I couldn't tell if it was the cold or something closer to fear. Some old, worn-down part of me, the part that used to make him soup, the part that used to believe every excuse, wanted to open that door the rest of the way. I want to be honest about that because I think pretending I felt nothing would be its own kind of lie, and I've had enough of those in my life already. He started talking fast, the way he used to when he was building a story on the spot. Something about a business deal falling through, a falling out with a roommate, needing just a few days to get back on his feet. The same voice, the same rhythm. I recognized every single beat of it because I'd heard this exact performance before, just aimed at a different outcome. I let him finish, and then I said something I'd actually thought about on and off for 3 years in case this exact moment ever came. I said, "Wes, I hope you find somewhere to stay tonight. I mean that. I'm not going to wish something terrible on you, but I need you to understand that whatever happens to you from here has nothing to do with me anymore. I stopped being your safety net the day I found out what you actually were, and I'm not starting again tonight." He asked quietly, almost like he already knew the answer, "Is this because of Brianna? Because of Sarah?" I said, "It's because of you. It was always because of you." I want to tell you what his face did in that moment because I've replayed it more times than I probably should. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even really shock. It was something closer to recognition, like some part of him had known for a long time that a night like this one was always going to come eventually, for someone, somewhere, and he'd simply been running just fast enough to keep it from being tonight until it finally was. And I closed the door. Gently, no slam, no drama, just a door closing on the last chapter of a story that had already been finished for 3 years. I heard secondhand about 6 weeks later that he ended up staying briefly at a shelter across town before finding some kind of temporary work arrangement through a distant family member out of state. I don't know exactly where he is now, and honestly, I stopped needing to know a long time ago. But I do know this. Brianna and I still talk occasionally, not close friends exactly, but something like it. Two women who went through a strange, specific kind of betrayal together and came out the other side able to look each other in the eye instead of at each other with suspicion. And Sarah in Cincinnati sent me a message about a year after all this happened, just to say thank you for finally giving a name and a pattern to something she'd spent years thinking was somehow her fault. It wasn't her fault. It was never mine either. If there's one thing I want you to take from this story, it's this. The version of revenge that actually works isn't the loud one. It's not the screaming match in the driveway, the keyed car, the dramatic public blow-up that feels good for about 10 minutes and changes absolutely nothing about the pattern that hurt you. The version that actually works is quiet. It's patient. It's documentation instead of accusation, truth instead of rage, and making sure that the people who need to know something actually know it, clearly, undeniably, in their own hands. I didn't destroy Wesley Carrington. I want to be honest about that, because I think it's important. I didn't do anything to him that he didn't do to himself, over and over, to woman after woman for years, until the truth finally caught up to the pattern faster than he could outrun it. What I did was simple. I stopped being the last domino standing between his lies and the consequences of them. People ask me sometimes when I tell pieces of this story whether it made me afraid to date again, whether it left me suspicious of every new person who's shown me kindness since. And honestly, for a while it did. I spent almost a year after this actively avoiding anything serious. And when I finally did start dating again, I overchecked things I never used to think twice about, asking early, direct questions I would have found awkward before, wanting to meet someone's friends and family much sooner than felt natural. I'm not going to pretend that instinct went away overnight, because it didn't. But I will tell you this. It also made me sharper. It made me someone who trusts her gut the first time instead of the fourth or fifth time when a phone lights up with a name that doesn't belong. It made me someone who knows deep in my bones now that love should never require you to stop asking questions. The people who deserve your trust have nothing to lose by earning it slowly. It's only the ones with something to hide who ever make patience feel unreasonable. I learned a few things going through this that I hope stick with you the way they've stuck with me. Trust your friends when they see something you can't see yet. Priya saw the shape of this 18 months before I did, and she never once said, "I told you so," not once. And that kind of loyalty is worth more than almost anything else in this story. Document things, even when it feels paranoid, even when it feels like you're betraying someone by keeping receipts of your own life. And when you find the truth, the real, full, undeniable truth, you don't owe the person who lied to you your silence. You never did. I also want to say something about Priya one more time before I let you go. Best friends like her don't come around often. The kind who see the thing you can't see yet, tell you gently, and then, when you're finally ready to face it, show up at your door in 11 minutes flat with nothing but love and a plan. If you have someone like that in your life, tell them. Don't wait for a crisis to say it. I wish I'd told her sooner how much her patience back at that wedding 18 months before any of this came out actually meant to me. So now I want to hear from you. If you were me, standing in that kitchen with that laptop open in front of you, what would you have done differently? Would you have confronted him right there on the spot, or would you have played it the way I did? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one, and honestly, some of the stories you share back tell me are just as wild as this one. If this story kept you watching until the very end, do me a favor and hit subscribe, because I've got more of these coming, and some of them I promise you get even more unbelievable than this one. I've got a story queued up for next week involving a fake inheritance and a mother-in-law who should honestly be in some kind of Hall of Fame for it. You will not believe what she tried to pull. Thanks for sitting with me through this one. I'll see you in the next story.